For years, Angie Penrod stood just outside the frame. The woman behind one of gospel music's most beloved voices, raising a household full of children, while her husband traveled the world singing to millions. And for years, she smiled, she supported, and she stood beside Guy Penrod at every Gaither homecoming concert, every recording session, every family photo that fans kept like a piece of scripture on their walls. What Angie has since said about those years quietly, honestly, in the kind of candid moments that rarely surface in the Christian music world, is something that will stop longtime fans of the Gaither Vocal Band in their tracks. Not because it's a scandal, and not because it tears anything down. What makes it land so hard is that it's the truth, and the carefully maintained world of gospel music and faith-based ministry. The truth about a real marriage, one with real weight and real cost, turns out to be the most unexpected thing of all. Stay with us, because what surfaces around the 10-minute mark of this video is a part of their story that most people who love Guy Penrod have never heard told fully. Once you hear it, the way you see that family and possibly your own will not look quite the same. If you spent any time in the Gaither homecoming world, the name Guy Penrod carries the same weight as a hymn learned in childhood. It lives somewhere deep, and it comes back without any effort at all. Guy joined the Gaither Vocal Band in 1994. Stepping into a group that already held a firm place in American Christian music history. And what nobody fully anticipated was how completely he would make that sound his own. That voice, warm, enormous, with a range that seemed to operate by different rules, and everyone else on the stage became the sonic identity of an entire era of gospel music. When Guy sang, you didn't simply hear it. You felt it settle somewhere in your chest and stay there. Born in Abilene, Texas, he carried that open country quality with him everywhere. And even in a suit jacket surrounded by orchestration at a homecoming taping, there was always something about Guy Penrod that felt unadorned and honest, the way wide Texas land looks before anyone puts a fence on it. For millions of fans who discovered the Gaither homecoming videos through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, Guy wasn't simply a performer on a stage. His face was familiar, his voice was comfort. And the way he talked about Angie and their children and their life back home in Tennessee made him feel like someone sitting across a table from you, not someone behind a microphone. That's the thing about Guy Penrod that sets the foundation for everything that follows in this story. He was never just a singer who happened to have a family. He was a family man who sang. And that distinction, it turns out, carried far more weight than anyone outside their home ever fully understood. Because while fans watched the stage, Angie Penrod was living an entirely different story. Think about what that life actually looked like, day after day. For a woman in Angie's position during those years, the Gaither Vocal Band under Bill Gaither's direction wasn't a regional act playing weekend dates. This was one of the most active and widely distributed musical ministries in American Christian life, with the homecoming series alone producing dozens of recordings and tapings filmed across multiple years and locations ranging from Nashville venues to the Holy Land itself, drawing crowds that filled arenas and sanctuaries across the country. And that was only the public F-facing part of it, because beyond the Gaither homecoming tapings came solo appearances, church engagements, extended tours, radio commitments, and the relentless behind-scenes demands that never appear on any camera. Guy Penrod was by every account fully devoted to that work. And gospel music doesn't produce voices of his caliber without years of discipline and sacrifice and a sense of calling that becomes inseparable from the man himself. That kind of calling doesn't get set down lightly. And Angie, a woman of deep faith who had married Guy knowing the shape of the life ahead of them, understood that completely. But understanding something and living inside it are two separate experiences. And for a long stretch of years inside the Gaither Vocal Band era, Angie was living inside something heavier than she let anyone watching from the outside see. By the time Guy had spent several years with the Gaither Vocal Band, the Penrod household had grown in ways that would have tested any family's foundation. He and Angie were raising children, 8 of them, eventually inside a life structured entirely around someone else's recording and touring calendar. Homecoming tapings, concert runs stretching for weeks, rehearsals, recordings, the full machinery of a ministry operating at that scale. Christian family life doesn't pause for a school play, a sick child, or the kind of ordinary Tuesday evening, when a marriage simply needs the 2 people in it to be in the same room. Guy was good at his work in a way that creates its own gravity, pulling him further in and asking more of him until the distance between the man on the Gaither homecoming stage and the man at the dinner table in Tennessee started measuring in more than just miles. And that's not a criticism of Guy Penrod or the ministry. It's the plain arithmetic of a life like this. The same arithmetic that anyone who has loved a pastor, a missionary, a doctor, or a serviceman knows from inside without needing explained. What Angie has said publicly in the years since that season closed carries none of the bitterness that lesser accounts might reach for. She is not a woman who traffics in grievance, but she has been honest, and her honesty is the kind that fans the Gaither homecoming world. People who have built their faith on real stories, rather than polished, ones genuinely deserve to hear. In interviews and in her own words at events where cameras caught her speaking more candidly, Angie described what it took to hold a home together, while Guy poured himself into gospel music ministry night after night, city after city. She talked about the loneliness that doesn't announce itself in any dramatic way, but accumulates slowly, the way sediment settles at the bottom of still water over time, quiet and heavy and invisible until it isn't. She talked about the conversations she and Guy had to have, the hard ones, the kind that couples in ministry life often never acknowledge publicly about what they owe to each other versus what they owe to the work God had given them. And those conversations, it turns out, change the direction of everything. Stay with us, because what Angie said about the moment their marriage arrived at its real crossroads and what Guy Penrod chose to do when he got there is the part of this story that Christian music media has consistently passed over. And it matters more than most people realize. What deserves a pause here before reaching that turning point is how genuinely rare it is for anyone inside the Gaither homecoming community to speak this plainly about the cost that ministry life places on a family. The culture surrounding these gospel artists and fans who have followed them for decades understand this instinctively tends to present a picture of cheerful sacrifice, of the road as extended worship, of homecoming as a reward waiting at the end of every hard stretch. There's real truth in that picture, and nobody is arguing otherwise. But another picture exists alongside it, one that never gets filmed. The birthday missed by a single day. The child's question, when is daddy coming home? Answered with a circled date on a calendar that then gets moved. The wife who learns to manage everything herself, not because she chose to, but because the situation requires it, who grows so capable of carrying a whole load alone, that the gap left by an absent husband starts to feel almost like the normal shape of things. That second picture is the one Angie Penrod was living inside. And the fact that she has described it not with drama, not with accusation, but with the plain tone of a woman who has made her peace with a difficult chapter is what has resonated so powerfully with the people who've heard her speak about it. Women in this audience. Women who have watched every Gaither homecoming video and prayed faithfully for these artists and their families across decades. Many of them know that second picture from their own experience, not from the gospel music world necessarily, but from their own kitchens and their own long nights and the grief they carried quietly without a name for it. When Angie speaks about those years, they hear something familiar, and recognition is a powerful thing. In 2008, Guy Penrod announced his departure from the Gaither Vocal Band, and the gospel music community responded the way it always does when one of its fixtures moves with genuine grief, loyal support, and the quiet wondering about what was really happening beneath the official statement. The official statement read, "Cleanly, family, home, children growing up faster than expected, and a father who no longer wanted to miss it." All of that was true, but Angie's account of what actually drove that decision, shared in pieces over time, in the careful way honest people tell difficult stories, reveals something with more layers than a straightforward pivot to her home life. She described with directness that catches you off guard if you're expecting the standard gospel world gloss, the weight she'd been carrying through those years, not as resentment, not as an indictment of Guy or the Gaither ministry, but as a woman giving an honest account of what years of absence, even loving and well-intentioned absence, does a marriage and to a mother raising 8 children. There were seasons, she said, when she felt less like a partner in a shared life and more like a single parent who happened to have a husband. The loneliness was real, she said, even surrounded by children. Even knowing the work Guy was doing carried genuine meaning, even believing with everything in her that he was following the calling God had placed on his life. And here's the thing that completely reframes that confession. She also said, Guy heard her, not the polite hearing of someone absorbing words they've been told before, and learned to acknowledge without acting on. He heard her the way a person hears something when it finally breaks through whatever insulation they've built around the part of themselves that already knows the truth. And that moment changed everything that followed. When Guy Penrod left the Gaither Vocal Band, the decision wasn't a retreat and wasn't crisis. And despite what some in the gospel community quietly speculated at the time, it carried no shadow over his faith or his ministry. What it was plainly and without any softening of it was a man choosing his wife. Angie has spoken about the conversation they had, the real one, not the version rehearsed for press statements. When Guy told her that no concert, no Guy at their homecoming recording, no platform in Christian music was worth the price she had been paying in silence, the home they had built, the 8 lives they were raising, the marriage they had made before God, those things were the ministry he told her, and everything else existed in service of them. She cried, she said, and the crying surprised her because she hadn't understood until that moment how long she had been waiting for someone to say exactly that to her. That's the confession that stops people when they hear it, not because it's dramatic and not because it pulls back a curtain on anything shameful. It stops people because it is nakedly, honestly real in a way that gospel music rarely permits itself to be. The Christian music world and longtime Guy Gio, their homecoming fans, understand this better than most carries a complicated relationship with honest talk about marriage. Artists who feel those homecoming stages operate under a standard of holiness that can make genuine human struggle read as failure, admitting that a marriage was hard, that the costs of ministry get carried by people who never asked for them isn't the kind of testimony that tends to make it into the catalog. Angie Penrod said it anyway. And in saying it, she offered something to every woman who has sat in a church pew or watched the Gaither homecoming video and felt the quiet distance between the life she was living and the one she had imagined. The response from people who have heard her speak about it has been steady and consistent. Women of this generation who built their lives around faith and family and who were rarely given permission to say out loud that it was sometimes harder than anyone acknowledged to have written, called, and walked up to Angie after events with tears already on their faces. Not because her story is sad, because it's true. And in the Gaither homecoming world, truth that costs something to tell carries the weight of testimony. What also deserves to be said and doesn't get said enough is how Guy himself has spoken about this chapter since stepping away. He hasn't deflected from it or smoothed the edges to protect his image. In interviews following his departure from the vocal band, Guy Penrod spoke candidly about the reckoning he had to do with himself, with his priorities, and with a calling he had to relearn how to hold without letting it consume everything around it. He talked about the particular pull that faces any man in ministry whose gifts live on a public stage, how easily the response of thousands of people in an arena can drown out the quieter, more demanding voice of one person at home. The person who shares your bed, raises your children, keeps the household running, and needs you present in a way no audience ever requires of you. That pull is real, he said, and he didn't resist it as early as he should have. That kind of honesty from someone who held as visible a place in gospel music as Guy Penrod is not something the Christian music world produces often, and it deserves to be heard clearly without the softening layer that Christian media sometimes applies to difficult admissions. For those who have followed Guy Penrod's journey across the years of his Gaither Vocal Band tenure and beyond, none of this changes anything about the music. Every note he sang on those homecoming stages carries the same weight it always did. Every performance redeemed. Every moment that voice filled an auditorium or a car on a long, familiar drive. None of it is diminished by knowing what was happening at home during those years. If anything, it deepens knowing that the man behind the voice was also a man learning slowly and at real cost to the people he loved. What putting first things first actually looks like in practice. That adds something to the listening. Gospel music talks constantly about testimony, about standing up and saying, "Here's what I was, and here's what God did with it." Guy Penrod has delivered that testimony in song hundreds of times across his career. But Angie's testimony, unscripted, offered not from a homecoming stage, but from the honest ground where marriages either hold or they don't, maybe the one that lasts longer. What it tells us about faith and family, and staying the course, is this. The work of a life is rarely as visible as the work of a ministry. The people who hold the center, who keep the fire going and the children fed and the home intact while the world watches someone else step into the light, are doing something sacred, even when no camera is pointed at them and no crowd is there to witness it. For fans who have followed Guy Penrod since those early Guy the Homecoming days, you already know what we mean when we say his voice always sounded like it was coming from somewhere real. Now, you know a little more about what that place looked like from the inside. If this story connects with something in your own experience, if you or someone you love has lived the tension between a God-given calling and the needs of the people standing right beside you, share that in the comments. This community holds wisdom worth hearing. There's one more piece of this story that most people haven't put together yet. When Guy Penrod stepped away from the Gaither Vocal Band, the group didn't simply fill a gap and carry on unchanged. The sound shifted. The chemistry on stage moved in a different direction. And Bill Gaither, who has spent his entire adult life watching gifted people come to and leave the platform he built, and who understands better than perhaps anyone alive what it means to release someone you built something with, responded to Guy's departure in a way that stayed with the people who heard it, across various interviews and Gaither Homecoming tapings over the years.